On November 18, 1978, in a remote jungle clearing in South America, over 900 people died in a single afternoon. They weren't victims of war, natural disaster, or disease. They were members of a religious community who believed they were building paradise on earth. This is the story of how a charismatic preacher turned hope into horror, and how a dream of equality became the deadliest mass murder-suicide in modern history. To understand Jonestown, we must first understand the man who created it, James Warren Jones, known to his followers simply as Jim Jones. Born in 1931 in rural Indiana, Jim Jones grew up during the Great Depression in a deeply troubled home. His father was a disabled World War I veteran with suspected Klan sympathies. His mother worked long hours to keep the family afloat. Young Jim was largely left to raise himself, and neighbors would later recall an unusual child, one who held elaborate funerals for dead animals and preached sermons to other children in a barn. But there was something else about Jim Jones that set him apart in 1930s Indiana. He was appalled by racism. In a time and place where segregation was simply the way things were, Jones befriended African American children. He questioned why his community treated people differently based on skin color. This sense of righteous anger at injustice would become the foundation of everything he built, both the good and the terrible. By his early 20s, Jones had found his calling, the church. He began preaching a radical message that blended Christianity with social justice. He didn't just talk about loving your neighbor. He demanded that his followers live it, insisting on racial integration at a time when it was not just controversial, but dangerous. In 1956, Jones founded his own church in Indianapolis, the People's Temple. From the beginning, it was different. White families and black families sat together. They shared meals. They called each other brother and sister, and they meant it. In the context of 1950s America, where the civil rights movement was just beginning to challenge centuries of oppression, this was revolutionary. Jones was a gifted speaker. Those who heard him described a man who could make you believe anything was possible. He spoke with passion about creating a society without racism, without poverty, without inequality. He backed up his words with action, establishing soup kitchens, job placement services, and a nursing home. The People's Temple didn't just preach about helping the poor. They did it. But even in these early days, there were warning signs. Jones demanded absolute loyalty. He held marathon sermons that lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours, exhausting his followers into a state of suggestible compliance. He claimed to have healing powers, staging elaborate fake healings where planted congregation members would miraculously recover from illness. He began to teach that he was not just a preacher, but something more. A prophet, perhaps even a reincarnation of Christ himself, or Lenin, or Buddha, depending on which audience he addressed. Jones was building something powerful, but it was built on a foundation of deception and control. And as his following grew, so did his paranoia. He became convinced that nuclear war was imminent and that the government was watching him. In 1965, he moved his congregation to Ukiah, California, a location he believed would be safe from nuclear fallout. Over 100 families followed him, leaving everything behind, trusting that their pastor knew the path to salvation. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the People's Temple had grown into a significant force. Jones established additional branches in San Francisco and Los Angeles, attracting thousands of followers, many of them poor, many of them Black Americans who had been failed by every other institution in society. The People's Temple offered them dignity, purpose, and community. It offered them a family. What they didn't yet realize was the price Jim Jones would eventually demand for belonging to that family. The man who preached equality was quietly building an empire of control. And soon, he would lead his followers to the jungle, to a place he promised would be heaven on earth. Instead, it would become their grave. By the early 1970s, Jim Jones had transformed the People's Temple from a small Indiana congregation into a powerful organization with thousands of members across California. But as his influence grew, so did the scrutiny. And Jim Jones did not handle scrutiny well. The People's Temple had become impossible to ignore. In San Francisco, Jones wielded genuine political power. He could mobilize thousands of followers to campaign for candidates, attend rallies, and vote as a unified bloc. Politicians courted him. He met with First Lady Rosalind Carter. He was appointed to San Francisco's Housing Authority Commission. To outsiders, Jim Jones appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a champion of the downtrodden, a voice for the voiceless. But behind the scenes, the People's Temple was becoming something far darker. Jones had instituted what he called catharsis sessions, brutal public confrontations where members were forced to confess their supposed sins before the entire congregation. These sessions could last all night. People were humiliated, beaten, forced to fight each other while Jones watched from his throne-like chair. Children were not spared. Parents were made to paddle their own children in front of hundreds of witnesses, while Jones dictated how hard to strike. Jones preached what he called apostolic socialism, but increasingly, his sermons focused less on social justice and more on him. He demanded to be called Father. He claimed he was God. He told his followers that he could read their thoughts, that he knew their every move, that betrayal was impossible because he was all-knowing. And many believed him, because to disbelieve meant losing everything, their community, their purpose, often their families. The organization had become all-consuming. Members were expected to turn over their paychecks, their property, their savings. They worked long hours for the temple, attended mandatory meetings several nights a week, and had little time for anything else. Jones deliberately separated families, moving children to communal living situations, creating dependency. If you tried to leave, you weren't just walking away from a church. You were abandoning your entire world. But in 1977, everything changed. A magazine called New West was preparing to publish an exposé about the People's Temple. Former members were coming forward with horrific stories, tales of physical abuse, financial exploitation, staged healings, and involuntary confinement. The reporter, Marshall Kilduff, had gathered testimonies and evidence that would destroy Jones's carefully constructed public image. Jim Jones knew the article was coming. And he had already prepared his escape. For years, Jones had been planning a remote settlement in the South American nation of Guyana. He called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but everyone knew it by another name, Jonestown. Jones pitched it as a socialist paradise, a place where his followers could live free from American racism and capitalism, where they could farm the land and build a society based on equality and cooperation. It sounded like the dream he'd been preaching for 20 years. But in reality, Jonestown would be something else entirely, a place so remote, so isolated, that escape would be nearly impossible. A place where Jones would have complete control, far from American law, far from journalists, far from anyone who might question his authority. In the summer of 1977, as the New West article went to press, Jim Jones fled to Guyana. Over the following months, he pressured nearly 1,000 of his followers to join him. He told them persecution was coming. He told them the government would take their children. He told them nuclear war was imminent. For many members, especially elderly African Americans who had experienced real persecution throughout their lives, these warnings seemed credible. They sold their homes, quit their jobs, and boarded planes to South America, believing they were escaping to paradise. What they found in Guyana was nothing like what they'd been promised. Jonestown was a collection of crude wooden buildings carved out of dense jungle. The accommodations were primitive, open-sided dormitories where dozens of people slept on thin mattresses inches apart. The heat was oppressive. The work was backbreaking. Members labored from sunrise to sunset, clearing jungle, building structures, planting crops in soil that yielded far less than Jones had promised. And there was no leaving. Jonestown was hours from the nearest town, accessible only by a single rough road. Passports were confiscated. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Jones controlled all communication with the outside world. Letters were censored. He monitored every phone call. If families back in California tried to reach their loved ones, they received cheerful letters describing a tropical paradise, letters that Jones had dictated or approved. The few people who managed to escape told a different story. They described a prison camp where loudspeakers blared Jones's voice 18 hours a day, where food was scarce and punishments were brutal, where even the thought of leaving was considered treason. But these warnings were dismissed as the lies of bitter defectors. After all, Jim Jones was a respected religious leader, a champion of civil rights. How bad could it really be? By late 1978, over 900 people were living in Jonestown, including nearly 300 children. They had followed a man who promised them equality and dignity. Instead, they had walked into a trap. And the world was about to discover just how deadly that trap would become. The prophet's kingdom had been built. Now it was about to fall, and it would take everyone inside with it. By 1978, Jonestown had become a world unto itself, a settlement of nearly 1,000 souls isolated in the Guyanese jungle. Jim Jones had achieved what every authoritarian dreams of, total control over his followers, far from the prying eyes of the outside world. But even in paradise, or what he called paradise, control requires constant reinforcement. And Jim Jones ruled through fear. Life in Jonestown followed a brutal routine. Members woke before dawn to Jones's voice crackling through loudspeakers mounted throughout the settlement. His sermons played constantly, a steady stream of paranoia and propaganda that followed residents everywhere they went. He spoke of enemies surrounding them, of the CIA plotting their destruction, of fascists in America who would torture and kill them if they ever returned. Sleep itself became a weapon of control. Jones held meetings late into the night, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning, ensuring his followers were too exhausted to think clearly, too tired to question. The work was relentless. Adults spent 12 to 14 hours a day in the fields under the brutal tropical sun, clearing jungle, planting cassava and other crops. The elderly, some in their 70s and 80s, were not exempt. Children as young as 6 were put to work. The promised agricultural paradise was producing far less food than needed. Meals consisted of rice, sometimes with gravy or a few vegetables, but protein was scarce. People were losing weight. Malnutrition was becoming common, especially among the children. But physical hardship was only part of the nightmare. Jones had created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and suspicion. He appointed loyalists to monitor everyone else, to report private conversations, to note who seemed tired of the work, who questioned the rules. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents. Spouses reported on each other. Trust became impossible. Everyone was watched, and everyone knew it. Punishments for infractions were severe and public. Adults accused of treason, which could mean anything from complaining about the food to expressing a desire to leave, were placed in a plywood box barely large enough to stand in, left there for days in the tropical heat. Children were lowered into a well at night, told that monsters waited below to devour them if they misbehaved. Some were forced to eat hot peppers until they vomited. These punishments were not hidden but announced over the loudspeakers, warnings to everyone else about the price of disobedience. Jones himself had deteriorated. He rarely left his cabin, emerging only to preside over meetings and issue commands. He was addicted to drugs, using amphetamines and barbiturates in dangerous combinations. His speeches became increasingly incoherent and paranoid. He spoke endlessly of revolutionary suicide, the idea that true believers should be willing to die for their cause rather than surrender to their enemies. At first, it seemed like abstract political rhetoric. But Jones began conducting drills. He called them White Nights. In the middle of the night, a siren would sound and everyone would be roused from sleep and ordered to the central pavilion. Jones would announce that enemies were attacking, that soldiers were coming through the jungle, that the end had arrived. Guards would distribute cups of red liquid, and Jones would order everyone to drink. He called it revolutionary suicide, a dignified death of their own choosing rather than capture and torture. Parents gave the liquid to their children first, then drank themselves, waiting to die. Then, after minutes of terror, Jones would announce it was only a drill, a loyalty test. The liquid had been harmless. But the message was clear: if Jones ordered them to die, they would obey. These drills happened repeatedly, sometimes weekly, conditioning residents to the idea that mass suicide was not only possible but noble. Each time, the resistance grew weaker. Each time, it became more normal. But not everyone had surrendered their will. Some residents were planning to escape. Others had family members in the United States who were desperately trying to make contact, who sensed that something was terribly wrong with the cheerful letters they received. One of those family members was a man named Leo Ryan. Leo Ryan was a congressman from California, and he'd been hearing disturbing reports about Jonestown for months. Relatives of temple members, calling themselves the concerned relatives, had been pleading with him to investigate. They spoke of family members who couldn't be reached, of children being held against their will, of a community that had become a prison. The stories seemed almost too extreme to believe, but Ryan was not a man who ignored his constituents. Ryan decided to see for himself. He organized a fact-finding delegation that would travel to Jonestown in November 1978. The group would include congressional staff, journalists from major news organizations, and members of the concerned relatives. They would visit the settlement, speak with residents, and determine the truth about what was happening in the jungle. When Jim Jones learned that Ryan was coming, he knew his carefully constructed world was in danger of collapse. For more than a year, he'd maintained absolute control. But now, outsiders with cameras and questions were about to walk through his gates. Some of his followers might use this opportunity to escape. The truth about Jonestown might be exposed. Jones had always said that the community would die before it surrendered. Now he would have to decide if that was merely rhetoric or a promise he intended to keep. The delegation was scheduled to arrive on November 17, 1978. In the days leading up to the visit, Jones held meeting after meeting, preparing his followers for what he called an invasion by enemies of the revolution. He reminded them of the White Knights, of their promise to die together if necessary. He told them that betrayal would not be tolerated, that anyone who left with Ryan was a traitor not just to the temple but to the cause of socialism, to the revolution, to everything they'd suffered and sacrificed for. The cage was closing. And everyone inside Jonestown was about to discover there was no way out. On November 17, 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan's delegation landed in Guyana. They traveled by small plane to Port Kaituma, the airstrip nearest to Jonestown, then made the final 6-mile journey by truck and tractor along a muddy jungle road. What they were about to witness would shock the world, but nothing could prepare them for how the next 24 hours would end. Jim Jones had agreed to allow the visit, but only because refusing would have confirmed the worst accusations. He'd spent days preparing, coaching his followers on what to say, orchestrating what he hoped would convince the delegation that Jonestown was the paradise he claimed. When Ryan and his group arrived on the evening of the 17th, they were greeted with music, dancing, and smiling faces. The residents had been ordered to put on a show, and they performed brilliantly. The delegation toured the facilities. They saw the neat rows of dormitories, the medical clinic, the fields where crops grew in the tropical soil. Residents approached them with testimonials of how happy they were, how Jonestown had given them purpose and community. Some of these statements were genuine. Despite everything, there were people who still believed in Jones's vision, who saw the hardship as necessary sacrifice. But others were performing under duress, knowing that any hint of discontent would bring severe punishment. That night, Jonestown held a special gathering in the central pavilion. There was music, entertainment, speeches about the community's accomplishments. Jim Jones presided, presenting himself as a benevolent leader guiding his people to a better life. Congressman Ryan even took the microphone and made conciliatory remarks, saying that from what he'd seen, people seemed happy. For a moment, it appeared the visit might end peacefully. But then, everything began to unravel. As the evening wore on, reporters noticed the armed guards stationed around the perimeter, the loudspeakers that broadcast Jones's voice constantly, the exhaustion on people's faces. A few residents began slipping notes to the journalists, desperate pleas for help hidden in handshakes and brief conversations. The notes said the same thing: "Help us get out. Please. We are being held against our will." One by one, people began to approach Congressman Ryan directly, whispering that they wanted to leave with him. By the morning of November 18, 14 residents had openly declared their intention to depart. For Jim Jones, this was the ultimate betrayal. His entire authority rested on the idea that Jonestown was a perfect society, that no one would ever want to leave. If people could simply walk away, especially in front of journalists with cameras, the illusion would shatter completely. Jones grew increasingly agitated. He tried to talk the defectors out of leaving, alternating between pleading and veiled threats. The atmosphere in Jonestown became electric with tension. Loyalists surrounded those who wanted to leave, arguing, crying, begging them to reconsider. Then, suddenly, violence erupted. One of Jones's lieutenants attacked Congressman Ryan with a knife, slashing at him before being pulled away. Ryan was shaken but not seriously injured, but the message was clear. They needed to leave immediately. The decision was made to evacuate. Ryan's delegation, along with the 14 defectors and several journalists, would return to the Port Kaituma airstrip and fly out. There weren't enough seats on the 2 planes for everyone, so they would make multiple trips. As they prepared to depart, more residents tried to join them, but were physically restrained by guards. Families were torn apart, children crying, parents shouting. The facade of paradise had completely collapsed. The group made the 6-mile journey back to the airstrip. It was early afternoon. They began loading people onto the planes, a small Cessna and a larger Twin Otter. The mood was tense but hopeful. They'd gotten out. They'd rescued people. In a few hours, they'd be safe in Georgetown, the capital, and the truth about Jonestown would finally reach the world. But Jim Jones had made his decision. He'd sent a tractor and trailer after them, filled with armed guards. As the planes prepared for takeoff, the tractor emerged from the jungle and drove onto the airstrip. Men jumped out carrying rifles and shotguns. What happened next was captured on camera by Robert Brown, an NBC cameraman who kept filming even as the shooting started. The gunmen opened fire on the planes and the people trying to board them. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot more than 20 times at point-blank range. He died on the airstrip. NBC journalist Don Harris was killed. NBC cameraman Bob Brown was killed, his camera still recording as he fell, capturing his own murder on film. San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson was killed. A defecting Temple member named Patricia Parks was killed. 11 others were wounded, some critically. One of the planes managed to take off with its pilot injured but alive. The other plane was disabled, its passengers hiding behind it, waiting for the gunmen to finish them off. But the gunmen retreated. They had accomplished their mission, preventing anyone from leaving with the truth. Now they returned to Jonestown to carry out the final phase of Jim Jones's plan. Back at the settlement, loudspeakers were already summoning everyone to the pavilion. Jones's voice echoed through the jungle, calling his followers to assemble one last time. The survivors at the airstrip could hear planes in the distance but had no idea if help was coming or if the gunmen would return. They huddled through the night, some wounded and bleeding, traumatized by what they'd witnessed. They had no way of knowing that at that very moment, 6 miles away in Jonestown, something even more horrific was unfolding. Jim Jones had always promised his followers they would die together if the dream ended. He'd rehearsed it in the White Nights, conditioning them to obey when the moment came. Now, with outsiders murdered and his authority shattered, Jones declared that the moment had arrived. Revolutionary suicide, he called it. A dignified death rather than allowing their enemies to torture and kill them. But as the residents gathered in the pavilion that afternoon, most had no idea they were assembling for the last time. They thought it was another meeting, another drill. They didn't know that this time, the poison would be real. As the sun began to set over the Guyanese jungle on November 18, 1978, over 900 people gathered in the central pavilion of Jonestown. Many believed it was just another meeting. Others suspected, with growing dread, that this white night would be different. They were right. What transpired over the next hour would become one of the most horrific mass deaths in modern history, captured on audio tape that Jim Jones had running, documenting his final act of control. Jim Jones stood before his congregation, his voice amplified through the speakers. He was agitated, rambling, his words slurred by drugs and exhaustion. He announced that Congressman Ryan had been killed at the airstrip. The lie came easily. He claimed Ryan's death meant they would all be blamed, that the military would come, that they would torture the elderly and steal the children. There was only one option left, he said, revolutionary suicide. They would die with dignity, together, rather than surrender to their enemies. A large metal tub had been prepared, filled with a mixture of grape-flavored flavor aid, cyanide, sedatives, and tranquilizers. Nurses and medical staff stood ready with syringes for the babies and elderly who couldn't drink. Jones ordered the process to begin with the children. Parents were told to bring their babies and young children forward first. The audio recording captures what happened next, and it is almost unbearable to hear. Mothers and fathers stepped forward with their children. Some were crying. Some moved as if in a trance. Nurses used syringes to squirt the poison into babies' mouths. Parents gave cups of the deadly mixture to their toddlers, to their young children, coaxing them to drink it like medicine. The cyanide worked quickly, causing convulsions, foam at the mouth, death within minutes. Children began screaming in pain. Parents watched their babies die in their arms, then took the poison themselves. Not everyone went willingly. The audio tape, which runs for 44 minutes, captures voices of dissent. One woman, Christine Miller, stood up and challenged Jones, asking if there were alternatives, if they might flee to Russia instead. Jones cut her down with rhetoric and manipulation. Others can be heard crying, questioning, resisting. But armed guards surrounded the pavilion. Some people were held down and forced to drink. Some were injected against their will. Jones kept talking throughout, his voice sometimes soothing, sometimes commanding. He told them not to be afraid, that death would be peaceful, like going to sleep. He called it an act of protest against an inhumane world. He praised those who drank quickly and scorned those who hesitated. When people screamed or cried, he told them to stop being hysterical, to die with dignity. His words were the last thing hundreds heard before the poison took effect. The process took over an hour. People died in rows, in family groups, holding each other. The elderly sat in chairs and drank. Teenagers formed circles. Mothers clutched their children. Some walked away from the pavilion to die in private, but there was no escape. The settlement was surrounded by jungle, and guards ensured no one fled. As the crowd thinned, those who remained saw the bodies of their friends, their family members, piled around the pavilion. Still, most drank when their turn came. Jim Jones himself did not drink the poison. When it was over, when nearly everyone else was dead or dying, he retreated to a chair and died from a single gunshot wound to the head. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or had a loyalist do it remains uncertain. His final act was consistent with everything else, maintaining control until the very end, ensuring he would not suffer the fate he'd imposed on his followers. When Guyanese troops and American officials arrived at Jonestown the following day, they confronted a scene beyond comprehension. Bodies lay everywhere, in the pavilion, in the fields, along the paths. Many were face down, as if they'd simply laid down to sleep. Families died in embraces. Children were in their parents' arms. The silence was complete except for the jungle sounds and Jim Jones's voice still playing through the loudspeakers, recorded sermons echoing through a settlement of the dead. The final death toll was 909 people, including 304 children. It was the largest loss of American civilian life in a single event until September 11, 2001. Among the dead were entire families, elderly couples who'd followed Jones for 20 years, young people who'd never known any life but the temple. Some had been true believers to the end. Others had been murdered, forced to drink poison or shot while trying to escape. A handful survived by hiding in the jungle or, in a few cases, by fleeing the settlement when the dying began. The word Jonestown entered the English language as shorthand for blind obedience, for the danger of charismatic leaders, for cult manipulation taken to its ultimate extreme. The phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, though technically inaccurate since Flavor Aid was used, became a metaphor for unquestioning loyalty to a dangerous ideology. But Jonestown was not simply about one madman and his deluded followers. It was about how a movement that began with genuine ideals, racial equality, economic justice, community support, could be twisted into something monstrous. Many who died at Jonestown were decent people seeking a better world. They were elderly African Americans who'd endured racism their entire lives and thought they'd finally found acceptance. They were activists who believed in social change. They were families looking for community in an increasingly fragmented society. Jim Jones exploited their hopes, their trauma, their desire for belonging. He used techniques that cult leaders have used throughout history: isolation from outside influence, sleep deprivation, public humiliation, the creation of an us versus them mentality. He gradually escalated his demands, boiling the frog slowly until people who would never have agreed to mass suicide found themselves unable to resist when the moment came. The tragedy raised profound questions that remain relevant today. How do we distinguish legitimate religious communities from dangerous cults? How do we balance religious freedom with the need to protect vulnerable people from exploitation? How do we recognize when a leader's charisma has become manipulation, when a community has become a prison? In the decades since Jonestown, there have been other mass deaths linked to cults and extremist groups: the Branch Davidians at Waco, the Solar Temple murders, Heaven's Gate, Aum Shinrikyo's attacks in Japan. Each time, observers ask how such things can still happen, how people can still be so easily manipulated. But Jonestown teaches us that it's not about intelligence or education or strength of character. It's about human needs, for belonging, for purpose, for meaning. And how those needs can be weaponized by someone who understands manipulation and control. The People's Temple began with a progressive message that challenged genuine injustices in American society. Many early members joined for good reasons. But somewhere along the way, perhaps from the very beginning, Jim Jones was building something else, a mechanism of control that would eventually consume everyone caught within it. The dream of utopia became a nightmare, and paradise became a graveyard. Jonestown remains a scar on American history, a reminder of the fragility of human reason in the face of manipulation, and a warning about the price of surrendering our critical thinking to any authority, no matter how righteous their cause appears. The children who died at Jonestown never had a choice. They trusted the adults who were supposed to protect them. The adults who died believed, in many cases until the very end, that they were part of something noble. They were wrong. And over 900 people paid with their lives for Jim Jones's delusion of power, for his paranoia, for his inability to surrender control even if it meant the destruction of everything he'd built. On November 18, 1978, in a remote jungle clearing, a utopian dream ended not with enlightenment but with poison, not with freedom but with the ultimate act of control. Jonestown stands as a testament to the darkest possibilities of human nature when charisma replaces ethics, when loyalty replaces reason, and when the promise of paradise lead.